Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Okay, today we are diving into something absolutely massive. We're unpacking a nearly three-decade clash that literally destroyed the golden age of Greece, the Peloponnesian War. And this wasn't just some local border dispute between neighbors, no. It completely rewired the entire geopolitical map of the ancient world.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the trap is set, then look at a tale of two powers, walk through the Archidemian War, the Sicilian disaster, the fall of Athens, and finally wrap up with the birth of history. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The trap is set. Fear, power, and inevitability. So right after the Greco-Persian Wars, this massive power vacuum opened up. And what's really fascinating here is how the historian Thucydides brilliantly boils this entire 27-year meat grinder of a war down to just two deeply human motivations: ambition and fear. He wrote that it was the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Lacedaemon, which is Sparta, that made war inevitable. It was the unchecked growth of Athenian power and the sheer panic it triggered in Sparta that set the trap. The real turning point for all that Athenian ambition? That happened in 454 BC. That's when Athens decided to move the treasury of the Delian League from the neutral island of Delos directly to Athens. Essentially, they transformed a defensive alliance into an Athenian empire. They started treating their so-called allies as ruled subjects, squeezing them for heavy tribute to fund their massive naval fleet. As you can imagine, this sparked deep, deep resentment across the Greek world, and basically handed Sparta the perfect excuse to push back. Moving on to Section 2, a tale of two powers, Athens versus Sparta. Before the actual swords clash, we need to understand the ultimate collision of military styles happening here. We are literally watching an unstoppable naval force meet an immovable land army. On one side, you have Athens, ethnically Ionian, fiercely democratic, ruling the seas and leading the Delian League. And on the other side, Sparta, Dorian, rigidly oligarchic, commanding an absolutely legendary land army and leading the Peloponnesian League. Total polar opposites. To really grasp the massive scale of this conflict, it helps to break down decades of chaos into four distinct eras. The whole thing kicks off with the Archidemian War in 431 BC, pauses for a really fragile peace in 421 BC, totally reignites with a catastrophic Athenian expedition in 415 BC, and finally concludes with the absolute surrender of Athens in 404 BC. Which brings us to Section 3, the Archidemian War, Walls and Waves. During this first decade of fighting, both sides basically just leaned heavily into their extreme strengths. The Athenian leader, Pericles, knew perfectly well that Athens couldn't beat the Spartan hoplites on an open battlefield. So his strategy? Just don't even try. He convinced the citizens of Attica to abandon their farms entirely and retreat behind the impregnable long walls that connected Athens to its port, Piraeus. Essentially, Pericles turned Athens into a giant artificial island, supplied entirely by the sea, while using their unrivaled fleet to launch surprise coastal raids on the Peloponnese. But, hiding hundreds of thousands of people behind walls has some pretty dire consequences. A devastating plague ripped through the desperately overcrowded city in 430 BC, and the numbers are just horrifying. It wiped out anywhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of the entire Athenian population. It even claimed Pericles himself. It was a massive, devastating blow that completely upended their whole defensive strategy. Yet somehow, despite the plague, Athens actually managed to strike a massive psychological blow. In 425 BC, at a place called Sphacteria, 300 elite Spartan hoplites were completely encircled and they actually surrendered. Let that sink in. In a world where Spartans fighting to the death was just an absolute given, this unprecedented surrender absolutely shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. However, even with that victory, neither side could manage a real knockout blow. Eventually, the key hawkish leaders on both sides, the Athenian Cleon and the Spartan Brasidas, were both killed in battle at Amphipolis. Without them, the two completely exhausted empires finally agreed to terms. The Peace of Nicias in 421 BC was supposed to last 50 years, but in reality, it was just a fragile truce born out of pure exhaustion, and it would only last a few very tense years. Next up, Section 4, the Sicilian disaster, the turning point of hubris. So here is the big question. Why risk it all on Sicily? Seriously, why would a recovering Athens, right in the middle of a super fragile truce, decide to send over 100 ships and 5,000 troops incredibly far from home just to conquer the Spartan alliance city of Syracuse? Well, the lure of immense resources and total, undisputed dominance of the Mediterranean was just too intoxicating for the Athenian assembly to turn down. But the resulting expedition was just a stunning chain of cascading disasters. First, Alcibiades, the highly charismatic leader who originally championed the invasion, gets recalled for a trial and promptly defects to Sparta. He literally hands over all of Athens' strategic secrets. Then General Nicias, who is left in charge, fatally procrastinates. Sparta sent reinforcements under Gylippus. The supposedly invincible Athenian fleet gets completely trapped in the harbor, and the entire Athenian army is either killed or enslaved. It was an absolutely catastrophic overreach that gutted them. And that leads into Section 5, the fall of Athens, the Ionian War, and Persian intervention. Entering the final, desperate phase of the war, Sparta, who was now taking advice from the traitorous Athenian Alcibiades, fortified a spot called Decelia, right on Athens' doorstep. This was a brilliant, devastating move. It established a year-round blockade, completely cut Athens off from its vital overland supplies and its silver mines, and led to the freeing of up to 20,000 Athenian slaves. Sparta was applying a constant strangling chokehold. And here is where we find the ultimate geopolitical irony. To finally defeat Athens, Sparta needed a navy. But to build a navy, they needed serious money. So what do? Sparta teams up with the Persian Empire. Yeah, the exact same enemy all the Greeks had so famously united to defeat just decades earlier. The Achaemenid Empire poured gold into Sparta to fund a massive new naval fleet. And that Persian gold bought the ultimate knockout blow. In 405 BC at the Battle of Aegospotami, the brilliant Spartan commander Lysander caught the Athenian fleet beached on the shore and completely destroyed it. Without a navy, Athens literally couldn't import grain. By 404 BC, facing total starvation, they had no choice. Athens surrendered, the Delian League was dissolved, the famous Long Walls were torn down, and Athenian democracy was temporarily replaced by a brutal, Spartan-backed oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. Finally, Section 6. The birth of history, Thucydides and the aftermath. When looking at the legacy of the war, it's wild to think that this catastrophic loss actually birthed a brand new academic discipline. Thucydides, who was an exiled Athenian general that actually lived through the war, refused to just blame the gods or rely on myths like writers before him. He pioneered historiography. He used an objective, strictly factual approach to analyze human behavior, power dynamics, and political realism. He essentially used this immense tragedy to create the modern blueprint for exactly how we study and record the past today. Now, the immediate political result of all this bloodshed was Spartan hegemony, total leadership and dominance over the entire Greek world. But honestly, it was a poison chalice. This total war had completely destroyed the region's prosperity. Sparta's incredibly rigid society just wasn't suited to running a sprawling, complex empire. Plus, the continuous grinding fighting had left all of Greece severely weakened, paving the way for future foreign domination by Macedon, and eventually, Rome. Ultimately, the Peloponnesian War wasn't just a military defeat for one city, it was a cultural devastation for an entire civilization. The golden age of Greece was officially over. The conflict permanently replaced the formal, limited, seasonal combat of the past with a horrifying new era of total war. It was driven by competing political ideologies, democracy versus oligarchy, that fueled bitter civil strife in these city-states for generations. Which leaves us with this final, really lingering question. If, as Thucydides observed, fear and the ambition of a rising power made this ancient war inevitable, are modern superpowers destined to repeat the tragedy of Athens and Sparta? We see this exact same dynamic playing out in geopolitics today. Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing the past, and I'll catch you next time.